Traveling on the roof of a train at 120 kilometers per hour without any protection was the price thousands of French people paid every morning to arrive at work on time. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you are watching this video from, so I can see how far it has reached. The platform at Saint-Lazare station was buzzing with activity that March morning in 1863. Auguste Moreau clutched a small, worn leather suitcase to his chest as he watched the iron monster huffing in front of him with a mixture of fascination and terror. It was not his first train trip, but it would be his first on those strange voitures impériales that everyone was talking about in the city's cafes and workshops. The locomotive exhaled columns of white steam rising into the gray Parisian sky, mixing with the smoke from the industrial chimneys that had transformed the French capital's skyline. Auguste had saved for 3 months to afford this trip to Versailles, where he hoped to find work in one of the new textile factories sprouting up like mushrooms after the rain. Every franc counted, so he had opted for the cheapest ticket, a seat on the uncovered upper floor. "First call for the train to Versailles," shouted the station master, a burly man in an impeccable blue uniform with a mustache that seemed to defy gravity. Auguste joined the human river flowing toward the cars. The station was an organized chaos of suitcases, baskets, children running between their parents' legs, street vendors offering hot pies and newspapers with still wet ink. The smell of burnt coal mingled with the aroma of freshly baked bread and the sweat of hundreds of bodies squeezed into a space too small for the number of people that the Industrial Revolution had brought to the city. The first-class cars shone with polished wood finishes and red velvet curtains. Auguste watched them with a pang of envy as he passed by. Passengers boarding them would not be journeying under the open sky, would not be journeying under the open sky. The second-class car was already full, entire families crowded into closed compartments, making the most of every available inch. Some carried baskets with live chickens, others dragged trunks that probably contained all their earthly possessions. Mid-19th century France was a nation on the move, a society reorganizing itself around the railways as if they were arteries of a living organism. Auguste finally found the metal staircase that led to the upper level of the imperial car. It was narrow and steep, almost vertical. With the suitcase in one hand and holding onto the railing with the other, he began to climb. Each step produced a metallic sound under his worn boots. Halfway up, a gust of wind nearly blew his hat away, and he had to make dangerous balancing maneuvers to keep it. The view from above was both impressive and terrifying. The upper floor was completely open, with simple wooden benches arranged in parallel rows. There was no roof, no walls, nothing separating the passengers from the infinite sky but the air itself. The seats were hard and without proper backrests, just planks nailed onto the car's structure. Some were already occupied by workers with grease and mud-stained clothes, women with scarves tied under their chins to protect their hairstyles from the wind, and a couple of young men who seemed to consider the whole thing a great adventure. Auguste found a spot near the center of the car and settled in as best he could. To his left sat an older man with calloused mason's hands, chewing tobacco and occasionally spitting to the side. To his right, a young woman with a baby wrapped in blankets tried to shield the little one from the wind that was beginning to blow harder. "First time up here?" the mason asked without looking at him directly. "Is it that obvious?" Auguste replied with a nervous smile. "Hold on tight when it starts. The first jerk always surprises newcomers." There was no more time for conversation. The train's whistle pierced the air with a sharp shriek that made several passengers cover their ears. Auguste felt a violent jolt as the locomotive began pulling the cars. The mason was right. The first surge almost threw him backward, and he had to grab the edge of the bench to keep his balance. The train started moving slowly, sliding out of the station with that distinctive rhythm that would mark the next 50 years of European history. First, they passed through the industrial suburbs of Paris, a landscape of smoking factories, red brick warehouses, and working-class neighborhoods where clothes hung on lines stretched between gray buildings. From his elevated position, Auguste could see inside the yards, the workshops, the lives of thousands of people who, like him, had left the countryside to seek fortune in the cities. The wind grew stronger as the train gained speed. Auguste estimated they were traveling at about 40 or 50 kilometers per hour, a speed that would have been unthinkable just a generation before. The air hit his face hard, making his eyes water. He had to squint to see clearly. Then, the real problem began: the smoke. The locomotive, leading the way, devouring coal and spitting steam, released black clouds of soot that the wind carried directly toward the rear cars. When the train took a curve, especially if the wind blew in a certain direction, passengers on the upper floor were engulfed in a gray, suffocating curtain of dense smoke. Auguste coughed violently, covering his mouth and nose with his jacket sleeve. The smell of burnt coal was so strong he could taste it on his tongue. "Breathe shallow and little," the Mason advised, accustomed to these conditions. "This happens every time we turn west. In 5 minutes, we'll be out of the cloud." Indeed, when the train straightened its course, the smoke dispersed partially, though a thin film of soot had already started settling on the clothes, hair, and skin of all the upper floor passengers. Auguste looked at his hands. They were stained black. He touched his face, and his fingers left marks of carbon residue. The woman with the baby had completely covered the child with blankets, creating a sort of protective cocoon. Other passengers had opened umbrellas, not against the rain but against the falling soot that drifted down like black snow. It was a strange and somewhat comical sight, dozens of umbrellas open on a rainless day, swaying with the jerks of the train. As they left Paris's outskirts behind, the landscape began to change. Farmlands now stretched out on both sides of the tracks, punctuated occasionally by small villages with stone churches and slate roofs. The French countryside in March showed that tender green of new growth, and Auguste felt a pang of nostalgia for the farm where he had grown up near Chartres. He had sworn never to work the land again, believing the city would offer opportunities his father never had, but at moments like this, covered in soot and buffeted by the wind, he wondered if he had made the right choice. The train passed through a short tunnel, and the experience was truly terrifying for the upper floor passengers. Suddenly they found themselves in complete darkness, surrounded by the deafening echo of the locomotive amplified by stone walls, breathing dense, hot air saturated with smoke. Auguste felt like he was suffocating. Some women screamed. A child started crying. It was only 30 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. When they finally emerged back into daylight, several passengers were coughing violently, and others looked as pale as wax. "That's the Moudon Tunnel," the Mason explained naturally, as one who had lived through the experience dozens of times. "It's short, but bad. Wait, until we hit the Saint-Cloud one on the way back. That one's long." Auguste wasn't sure he wanted to experience a longer tunnel. He was beginning to understand why these tickets were so cheap. It wasn't just discomfort or lack of luxury, real dangers were involved. He'd heard stories of passengers struck by tree branches growing too close to the tracks, of people who had lost hats, suitcases, and occasionally their balance on sharp curves. There were even rumors of an accident the previous year when a miscalculated metal structure had swept several passengers off a car's roof near Rouen. The sun had managed to break through the clouds and now shone with surprising intensity for March. Auguste appreciated the warmth at first, but soon realized it brought its own problems. Without a roof to provide shade, the sun's rays struck the passengers directly. The metal car began to heat up, making the benches uncomfortable to the touch. Some people tried to create shade with newspapers or scarves, but it was mostly futile. An elderly woman 2 rows ahead began to feel dizzy from the heat and movement. Her neighbors fanned her with whatever they had at hand while another passenger went down the stairs in search of water. It was clear this way of traveling was not suitable for everyone. Very young children, the elderly, the sick. For them, the upper floor represented more than just discomfort. Midway through the journey, the train slowed as it approached a small station. From his elevated position, Auguste could see the entire platform, where more passengers waited with their luggage and hopes. Some looked up with curiosity and apprehension, clearly wondering what it would be like to travel on that second level exposed to the elements. The train stopped with a screech of brakes that made the whole metal structure vibrate. Taking advantage of the pause, Auguste stood up to stretch his legs, which were already starting to go numb from the uncomfortable position and constant vibrations. From his vantage point, he had a privileged view of the small station and the village around it. It was one of those towns being transformed by the arrival of the railway. Auguste could identify the old constructions, the 12th century church, the stone houses with timber framing, and the new buildings rising around the station, a hotel for travelers, an inn, some shops. The railway didn't just transport people, it completely transformed the economic and social geography of France. More passengers boarded, including a group of workers who clearly had been doing heavy labor. They smelled of sweat and earth, speaking in a dialect Auguste didn't fully recognize. They were probably temporary workers, those whom the railway allowed to move from region to region as labor was needed. Labor mobility was another major change that the steam era had brought with it. The whistle sounded again, and the train resumed its journey. Auguste noticed the sky had darkened considerably toward the west. Gray, threatening clouds accumulated on the horizon, moving quickly in their direction. The Mason had seen them too, and shook his head resignedly. "A storm is coming," he said simply. The first drops began to fall when they still had about 20 minutes to reach Versailles. At first, it was a light drizzle, almost pleasant after the heat of the sun, but within minutes, it turned into a torrential downpour. The water fell so hard, it was impossible to keep eyes fully open. The upper floor passengers became defenseless victims of the storm. Auguste curled up as best he could, using his suitcase as a pathetic shield against the rain. The woman with the baby had managed to shelter herself under an umbrella held by another passenger, creating a small oasis of relative dryness. But most simply resigned themselves to getting soaked. Water ran over their clothes, their hair, forming puddles on the car floor that swayed from side to side with the train's movement. The worst part was that the rainwater mixed with the accumulated soot, creating a black, greasy liquid that stained clothes and skin even more. Auguste felt black rivulets running down his face and neck, soaking his shirt. His suitcase, containing his only change of clean clothes and the documents he would need to present at the factory, was being battered by the rain. He tried to protect it better, but it was useless. Everything was getting drenched. The Mason laughed with that resigned laugh of someone who had experienced similar situations many times before. "Welcome to the Imperial Boy, the price of progress." And he was right in a perverse way. This was the price of being able to travel distances that once took an entire day in just an hour or an hour and a half. This was the price of mobility, of being able to seek work in other cities, of connecting Paris with surrounding towns in a way that would forever transform the social and economic structure of France. The voitures à impériales were a perfect symbol of their era. Ingenious but imperfect, efficient but brutal, modern yet still bound by the technological limitations of their time. The engineers of the Compagnie du Chemin de Fer de l'Ouest had solved a real problem: how to transport more people without building longer trains or more cars, but their solution had created its own challenges. The storm finally began to abate as the train entered the outskirts of Versailles. Auguste was completely soaked, covered in a mixture of water, soot, and mud. His clothes weighed twice as much because of the moisture. His boots made wet noises with every movement. He looked around and saw that all the other upper floor passengers were in similar condition. They looked like shipwreck survivors who had miraculously endured a maritime disaster. When the train finally stopped at Versailles station, Auguste descended the metal staircase with trembling, numb legs. The contrast, with the first-class passengers elegantly stepping down from their closed, heated compartments, could not have been greater. They arrived fresh, clean, dignified. The imperial passengers arrived like refugees from some industrial catastrophe. But they had arrived. And that was what mattered. Auguste headed to the station's washrooms to try to make himself presentable before his interview at the factory. As he washed his face with cold water, watching the black water run down the basin, he reflected on the experience he had just lived through. The 19th century was a time of extraordinary contradictions. On one hand, humanity was conquering distances in times that would have seemed impossible just 50 years before. On the other, these conquests came with discomforts, risks, and degradations that the rich could avoid, but workers had to endure. The voitures impériales would not last forever. Auguste sensed that eventually technology would improve, that safer and more. In history, progress tasted of soot, and in history, progress tasted of soot and had the rough texture of wet clothes. As he walked the streets of Versailles toward the address he had written on a now damp and crumpled piece of paper, Auguste passed by the station and saw the train preparing for the return trip to Paris. Some passengers were already beginning to board the upper floor. Some were veterans like the mason. Others were novices who didn't yet know what awaited them. Life in France was changing at a dizzying speed. Railways had begun operating just 30 years before, in 1832, with the Saint-Étienne to Lyon line. Now, in 1863, thousands of kilometers of tracks crossed the country, connecting cities and towns, transforming local economies, creating new industries, destroying old ones. Rural France was giving way to an habité à industrial and urban France. Peasants were becoming workers. Traditional artisans competed with factories producing en masse. Old local loyalties dissolved into a broader national identity facilitated precisely by this ability to move, to travel, to see beyond the village church steeple. And the voitures impériales were a fundamental part of this transformation. They allowed workers like Auguste to seek employment within a radius of 100 kilometers or more. They allowed families to visit relatives in other cities. They allowed merchants to expand their markets. They allowed ideas, news, fashions to circulate more rapidly. The price was discomfort, certainly. It was traveling exposed to the weather, to smoke, to risk. It was arriving dirty, wet, tired. But for thousands of French people, it was a price worth paying. Auguste got the job at the textile factory. For the next 5 years, he would make that trip twice a week, always on the upper floor because he could never afford a better ticket. He would experience snowstorms in winter, stifling heat in summer, the eternal soot in all seasons. He would see minor accidents, hats flying, suitcases falling, and hear of major accidents on other lines. But he would also make friends on those trips. He would meet Marie, a seamstress who also traveled regularly and whom he would eventually marry. He would watch the towns along the line grow and prosper. He would witness gradual improvements in the cars, the tracks, the entire railway system. By 1870, the voitures impériales would gradually disappear, replaced by safer and more comfortable designs. But during that crucial decade from 1860 to 1870, they transported millions of French people, being an integral part of the country's transformation. Decades later, when Auguste was an old man telling stories to his grandchildren, he would speak of those trips on the upper floor with a mix of pride and wonder. The children, already used to modern trains with closed compartments and heating, would find it incredible that their grandfather had traveled in such a primitive and exposed way. But that is how progress is. Each generation builds on the discomforts and sacrifices of the previous one. The voitures impériales were a necessary link in the chain that would eventually lead to high-speed trains of the 20th and 21st centuries. They were imperfect, uncomfortable, sometimes dangerous. But they were also brilliant in their simplicity, effective in their purpose, and transformative in their impact. In the streets of Versailles, with his clothes still damp and stained with soot, but with a work contract in his pocket, Auguste Moreau represented millions of people navigating the transition from the old world to the modern. They did not do it with comfort or elegance, but with determination and necessity. The 19th century was not a romantic time for most people who lived through it. It was a time of brutal adaptation to new realities, of sacrificing present comfort for future opportunity, of enduring the imperfections of technological progress because the alternative was being left behind. The voitures impériales were a perfect symbol of all this: imperfect progress, uncomfortable modernity, a future built on the wet and soot-covered shoulders of those who had no choice but to adapt.